Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill. Lucy Colback undertook a 4-year journey around the world to interview survivors of World War II. The result is this super book, Afterbursts. There's my copy. Lucy joins me now to explain the process and share some of the stories she heard. The links to purchasing the book are, as always, in the description below, or you can find it wherever you buy your books. So we continue the discussion from earlier today. So good afternoon, Lucy. How are you today?
I'm excellent, thank you very much. Very excited to be here.
So we were just discussing already the whole meaty issue of interviewing veterans and the best circumstances to do it, and whether sometimes you're getting a polished version of events, or you're getting versions new, and is it better to speak to a veteran the first time, or is it better to speak to them? Take us through your process of which obviously is fairly lengthy, of how you came up with the idea, and did you have a particular methodology you went into? I would like to interview these people in a particular style.
So, well, can I show you my first slide, and that will sort of explain where I came from? So I saw this photo. I was visiting Tongchong in China in 2014. It's where the Burma Road came into China broadly, and there was a lot of argy-bargy between China and the US even then. Well, actually, China and Japan, history wars were sort of flaring. And I looked at this photo and I thought, wow, haven't we come a long way, and not all of it good. And so my original plan, I'm coming to the point here, was that I was going to do something very relevant to the time about Japan, China, and the US specifically. And I worked for the FT at the time, and my editor at the time said, okay, and I said, I'm going to quit because I want to go and interview World War II veterans. And because I wanted to find out from them, particularly in China, where, as we know, the way that people were treated was very brutal. Anybody who's read The Rape of Nanjing will know that.
Yep.
The comfort women issue, so many very, very brutal circumstances there. So I thought, would the Chinese people particularly be interested in having this revenge, right? Because all the people who were rioting were in their 20s, and you think, well, none of them were around during the war, and they're beating up Japanese people and Chinese people who are driving Japanese cars. So would their elders actually be keen on this? So I thought I'll go and ask them. So that was the main thing. And also we were hitting Brexit. There was a lot of division everywhere. There was a lot more nationalism. And a few of the veterans were starting to write editorials, Holocaust survivors. Franklin Medhurst, who I did interview for the book, a British chap who wrote to The Guardian and said, my friends died for unity in Europe, please don't vote for Brexit. So there was all of this division going on, right? And so I thought, how do they feel? So I thought, I'll go and ask them. Why I did it in person, I suppose, because it was pre-COVID and it was possible. And so I wrote this article, and this is what happened. I wrote this article, and somewhat stupidly, I didn't say, I'm interested in Japanese, Chinese, and US vets. I just said, I'm going off to interview World War II vets. And a whole bunch of people wrote to me and said, hey, come and get my story. And one of the first was Ernest Hilton, who's sitting here at the River Kwai by the bridge. And he and his wife invited me to Bangkok to go and stay with them for a few days. And his wife said, do you want to go to Kanchanaburi? And I went, hey, what? And then I sort of educated myself a bit about it, and I went, yes, absolutely, I want to go to Kanchanaburi. So that on the right there is Sai Sampan walking along Hellfire Pass, and Ernest, as I said, sitting by the River Kwai. And he was a German Jew whose family ran to Holland because his dad wanted to keep his business and thought that Holland would be safe because it was neutral. And obviously it wasn't, and we sort of know what happened then. So they were told to go to Westerbork because they already had visas. Most of their family, I think his dad had 3 brothers, and they had all already left for the US. And so they were told to go to Westerbork with their kit, and they were exchange Jews. So he said, I had a relatively good Holocaust because they were kept in a different kind of camp, and he was with his family. But, the grandparents are brought along later and so on. Anyway, Ernest was on one of the 3 lost transports, which the exchange Jews were put on these trains from Bergen-Belsen, which is where he ended up, and they were shuttled around the outside of Berlin being strafed by the RAF because they didn't know what was in the trains, obviously. And then eventually they were left in a siding by their guards who ran away. So I think they were on that train for a week or more. And then he was finally rescued by Russians on horseback. So from imagining that I was going to do something about Japanese, Chinese, and the US, I got Ernest, who said, you're going to have to talk to Russians and Germans as well. So this is where we got to. I ended up with massive mission creep. And so I just added this slide also to show. So I ended up talking quite a lot about history wars. As I mentioned before, you know, China was bringing up a lot on its wartime grievances, which Mao had sort of let slip, but you know, is expedient to raise again. And this is actually the first engine, sorry, skipped ahead there. This is the first engine that went across the Death Railway when it was opened, which it never actually functioned. And this is in the Yushukan Museum in Tokyo. And on the right-hand side, there is the map of where it was. It was actually a route that the Brits originally considered doing, I think, in the late 19th century, and then realised that they couldn't do it, even with all their engineering equipment. And of course, the Japanese thought prisoners of war somewhat expendable. So they thought they could just cut through the jungle with the people, which they did. But it's not really obviously mentioned in a huge amount of detail in the Yushukan Museum. They have this very nice engine on display here, but not an awful lot about the background. So the book kind of talks about this aspect of our side, their side, you know, how we tell a history, how they tell a history. So this is Peter. So this is actually, Peter's dad fought with Rommel in North Africa. Peter's dad had been a World War I veteran, and he had fought in France, and he had survived by sticking close to a chap who said, stick with me and I will make sure that you make it out of here. And he did, and he made it out of there with a great love of France. So he wasn't particularly enthused when Hitler started talking about another war. But the only way to stay out of Hitler's orbit, in his thinking, was to join the regular army. So he did. He rejoined the army and ended up in North Africa, as I said. But I came to Peter, German, because Peter was at the same school as Ernest after the war. So Ernest, German Jewish Holocaust survivor, became best mates with Peter at school. And it was a school which, by completely random coincidence, in Switzerland, my father attended for a couple of terms until he was rusticated for decking a Hitler Youth. So I went to join Peter in France for a few days, where he was at his hunting lodge. And, you know, I think in terms of the process, because these, particularly the early people, came to me personally and by personal contacts, it was very much come, stay, hear our story, chat with us, hang out. And then, you know, I took recordings and then made sort of their story out of it, which then weaves into the whole war and the history of the war. So Peter, because he was a boy, you know, 5, 6 at the outbreak of the war, he remembers it from sort of a child's perspective. And then also on top of that, he puts his subsequent investigations, explorations, education about the war. So there is a bit of both. Obviously, there's some revisionism in the way they speak, but there's also some specific memories, because the specific memory of where I was when the war broke out, I mean, he remembers being on his Ruder runner. I probably said that wrong, but it's like a little thing where, I guess it's like a little toy horsey thing, and it's got wheels on it, and he's paddling around and he's going, shit, that's, you know, that's over now. My life is over. Shit, my childhood is gone. So you get both. You get the sort of experience of hanging with this chap in his hunting lodge who's clearly a bon vivant, and hearing kind of all these stories about his dad, the anxiety of the war. His dad actually told him at one point when he was in training that Hitler came to give a talk to the guys at the camp, and he said, I could have shot him. I was 50 meters away and I could have shot him. but I didn't.
Wow. Wow. Were you consciously looking for people with overlap, people from Europe who fought in the Far East, or, people from a particular country who ended up living somewhere else? Because you get that different kind of perspective. As I said in the earlier show with John, my granddad never left the UK in World War II, so although he was interesting to some extent, he hadn't really met people from different cultures, he hadn't traveled the world or anything, so his recollections were in a very narrow field. But it seems to me that, looking at your book, you like to have people who overlapped in the old Venn diagram of different perspectives.
I love a Venn diagram. I mean, they do overlap, but it's coincidence. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd say, in this particular operation, in this particular battle, I had so and so on this side, and then, oh my god, I found so and so on that side, whether it's by luck or by design. But one of the things I realized, and this was very much because when I wrote the piece, and I wasn't specific about who I was looking for, when people came to me and said, can I tell you my story, I just thought, well, how rude to say no. I mean, I genuinely thought, I can't possibly say no, because that would be just a terrible thing to do. When somebody wants to share with you this experience, you can't say no. I thought, I'll get the experience and I'll work out what I'm going to do with it later, which was a sort of very painful 2 and more years of later. But the whole process has taken me 8 years to get here. So it was 4 years of the interviewing of, again, people that came to me largely. And when people find out that you're doing something like this as well, they go, oh, I can introduce you to so and so. And again, I didn't say, yeah, well, I'm not really all that interested in that. Thanks very much. That's an area that doesn't, you and I were discussing earlier that some people are regularly interviewed, so their stories become quite a lot more rehearsed. And maybe there was some deliberate desire not to interview people that I knew had been regularly interviewed. And I didn't avoid it entirely. I didn't also necessarily want people who had written their own autobiographies. I couldn't avoid that entirely. But for instance, Fergus Ancorn, and I'm slightly taking you into Brits here when we're supposed to be talking about everything but Brits. But Fergus Ancorn, who's very well known, he wrote his own book, and it's a phenomenal book. But I did interview him. But the bits that I chose for what I included in my work, I tried to choose bits that he hadn't covered, and it's more of, I feel mine's very much more an emotional picture than a battle, and this is what happened and this is what happened. This is how I felt, and this is what I saw, and this is just what astonished me.
And that connects with what I asked John about the reality is you spoke to people a long time after World War II. There are some historians who are able to go and speak to these guys and women in 1945 and 1946 when everything was still fresh. Well, you didn't have that luxury, and neither did I. But that also means that there is that doubt of authenticity, but not when it comes to emotion. If someone was there witnessing the dropping of the atomic bombs, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or whatever it would be, the siege of Leningrad, they may get dates wrong. They may remember the date the arrival of parcels came being incorrectly, but the actual memories of being hungry are authentic, aren't they? And I think that, in looking at what your book, that you're looking for that emotional honesty. Rather than necessarily trying to tell a story of a particular campaign or particular theatre of operations. It's just, here's what the hell these people went through.
Yeah. And so on that note, so this is Edwin Leder. He was a German artillery spotter, spent days up a tree. He'd spend 3 days up a tree or so, and then he'd spend 3 days kind of, resting back on the ground again. And one of the most vivid images for me is when he described having given the coordinates for a bunker in which the Russian soldiers were sitting and how they came out. And all of this I had to do through an interpreter, because he was 100 at the time, by the way. And also I found him because of Ernest. Again, Ernest sent me to these German chaps. And I was doing it through an interpreter, and I couldn't quite believe what the interpreter told me when he said the shell hit the bunker and they flew out like butterflies. And he said, he said, I can't see, I don't want to talk, I can't see it, I can't. And you're just there in that moment. And you know that's, he's seeing it again. It was just, and that's, for me, that was, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily went, I have to speak to people in person, but whenever somebody offered me someone on and this was again before COVID, so I guess, you know, people were slightly less used to the interview sort of format by video, but you have to be in the room. You have to feel that energy. You have to be kind of communing with them, if you like, to really get that sense of how they feel about it. And so, yeah, his was very vivid. And he ended up as a prisoner of war in Siberia. You know, he was up a tree when the surrender happened, and you know, was dragged down by Russian soldiers who kicked the crap out of him. You know, somewhat understandably, lost all his teeth, ended up in Siberia. You know, and marveled at how he was occasionally given 2 pieces of bread with sugar in between if he did a good job.
Well, a question just coming from Andreas, and I know, you know, we'll get into the fact you do speak several languages, but Andreas said, how much did you trust the interpreter? But there's also there's interpretation and there's translation, and there's that strange gap in between. And I, you know, living in a bilingual family as I do, you know, sometimes I try and explain something, there just isn't a translation for this. And, you know, certain idioms and phrases. So when you're dealing with a second language, did you have a policy of how you approached it?
Oh, I mean, it's an excellent question, because, you know, when I went on this particular trip, I had with me, so Edwin and Hans, who's in the next slide, they both were at a rest home, and I went through the guy who ran the rest home that Ernest knew, and the guy who ran the rest home was himself a military man, and he took his grandson, who was an absolutely charming, wonderful chap of 18, 19, you know, and mature beyond his years, and whose English was, you know, I would say 90% fit for purpose. So I, you know, it's a bit of a suck it and see, right? It's luck.
Yeah.
You have no idea what you're going to get. And so in some instances, you know, particularly with very, very local dialect Chinese, I'm almost relying on the people that I'm with to sort of, you know, get the story in a way. And sometimes we were an entourage. I mean, I didn't put on a photo of some of the entourages that we had with the Chinese vets, but so the question is most pertinent, though, when I interviewed the Russian veterans. And one of the stories I didn't include, because I did interview, you know, a number of Russian veterans, and I did end up having to be selective. But one of the stories I didn't include was with a chap that I interviewed, whose, you know, birthday and his father's birthday had to be the same as mine, which is November 23rd. And I asked, so with the Russians, I did have a set list of questions to answer your, you know, early question. And that was, one of them was very much, how do you feel about the enemy these days? You know, that was one of the key things I went in to ask. How do you feel about the enemy these days? What are your worries about the world today? You know, less of which made it into the book, if I'm honest. That's probably book 2. But because, you know, it's harder to do that verbatim. And this is a verbatim book. I asked the first interviewee I had in Russia, how do you feel about the enemy? And he said something along the lines of, as most of them did, you know, I just want peace, you know, I have no ill will. And, you know, I think he said something about, in Moscow there was a ceremony for children, and, you know, our children are born for peace, not for war. And so, well, that's encouraging, because, you know, that's what the American veterans I've spoken to say as well. It's what the Brits say, you know, that's what you know, all the enemy soldiers say. And in fact, I went straight on from seeing these Germans to seeing the Russians. And this German, Hans, said to me as I left, he said, oh, you're going to Russia next. He said, well, I hope you have a good trip, and I hope you find, he said, I bore no ill will towards the Russians. It was a job I had to do. And I hope you find Russians who feel the same, was basically what he said to me. You know, I hope you find that the Russians feel the same. So I said to Boris, you know, I'm very encouraged to hear that. The other veterans feel the same way. And it wasn't until I got my tapes back from the person I asked to do the translations, when I decided I was going to do it verbatim, that it turned out that he had said, You're the only one who thinks that.
Right.
To this 90-something-year-old man, when I'd say, oh, you know what, everybody feels the same way, you're good, you know, everybody feels like peace and all that sort of stuff is great, and this Soviet interpreter said to him, yeah, you're alone in that.
Wow.
And I just thought, when I got this back, I felt so sick for this poor man. And he went, really? Because then he says, really, you know, always saying that the Americans only do shit isn't really helping anyone, you know. So he then has a conversation with the interpreter about this. I have no idea what's going on at this point.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Because I can't get involved in the conversation. So it turned out that particular interpreter, who then took me to see another 7 or 8, you know, Soviet Red Army soldiers, wasn't necessarily doing both sides the best service that he could.
Yeah, and this brings us to the next question I was going to ask you about the people being there with a survivor, their partner, their children, their carer, whoever it would be, who don't necessarily want their loved one to revisit painful memories, but the loved one might be finding the process of bringing up these memories very cathartic and very useful in there, because it's never too old to deal with PTS and problems in the war. Just because you're 95 years old, it's not too late. So how did you handle those situations of perhaps a loved one said, do you really want to talk about that, dear? You know, because you don't want as an interviewer to push someone to say something that they don't want to say, or indeed make yourself unwelcome in the environment for being the pushy interviewer who made Uncle Jack talk about things he didn't want to. Did you, I mean, I guess you just, some of Veronica said it in the sidebar, you just have to kind of feel your way through each situation, I suppose.
And the answer to that is very much yes, essentially. I mean, I think, you know, when I had a loved one in the room, mostly speaking, those were not particularly productive interviews. I mean, I did have some, you know, I went to stay with an old friend of mine and her aunt who lived in Wageningen, actually. And I mean, this was also quite early on in the process, and I have deep regret. You know, there were about 5 or 6 stories that I didn't record, so they haven't made it into the book because I didn't have their words. And when I decided I was going to do verbatim, they couldn't make it in. In that instance, you know, the friend was very sympathetic to just letting the whole thing flow. You know, yep. She wanted to hear the story. I think she felt that it would be cathartic too. It isn't always like that. Sometimes what's more annoying is that you have someone in the room who sort of has heard all the stories before, so they're filling in the gaps, and then it blows up. You know, I had one situation where I was interviewing a couple, and you know, it was his birthday. I can't remember what year it was, 97, something like that. And you know, he was a bit squiffy, and his wife was a bit squiffy, and you know, and the son said, let's do an interview. And so, you know, and it was on video, and I just felt like they were asking the questions and they were answering the questions that they wanted to answer, and I didn't, you know, I didn't really get anything out of that, but you know, it was a service in a way. I'm sure that they'd heard all those stories before, and they had them on maybe they had them on video, maybe they didn't. Now they have them on video, so that's good for them. You know, they've got what they wanted out of it, but I didn't get what I was looking for so much. So I think I often had more that, not so much the, you know, don't go into the deep trauma. I had more the, oh yeah, I know the story. Let me tell you the story.
Yeah. And the helpful next of kin who's read a few books, who adds information that that isn't applicable at all to the participant's particular role in the battle. You know, I've had that where I'm talking to someone about, I don't know, 30 Corps on the road to Arnhem, and the next of kin will start talking about what's happening at the bridge at Arnhem because they've seen the movie A Bridge Too Far. And you go, yeah, you kind of want to go, shut up. I know that what you're saying is interesting, but it's completely irrelevant to why we're here to speak to Fred again. And Rob asked a question, and Rob's working on his various projects. And is there a risk that the people who come forward for interviews are self-selecting and therefore share views? You know, there's that, if the person who puts their hand up and says me first to be interviewed, that can be great and also not great.
There's almost no other way that you can find them, though. I mean, when you're doing something like this, you know, there are people who naturally want to talk, and so yes, they have they may have an angle, or they may have a particular message that they want to share, and so I've always said it's a self-selecting group. And maybe this is why I never really had anybody who said, yeah, I had one guy who said, yeah, the Japanese guy walked in my living. He was 100 already at the time. If I had a Japanese guy walk in my living room, I'd shoot him from the feet up and I wouldn't stop. You go, mate. And he'd never seen combat, by the way. He was a military policeman. He was on the Burma Road, and he'd heard a lot of terrible stories. So I suppose, he had sort of received trauma. He hadn't actually seen any of it himself. So yes, and we've talked, and you talked with John about the problem of kind of received memory, incorrect memory. I've been told that everyone was the first person into Bergen-Belsen, and everyone was, the last person on the boat out of Shanghai. And, there are all these tropes, if you like, but you kind of, you have to put them in quotes, or you have to, and then I did meet someone who was in 3 Commando, and, said we arrived in Bergen-Belsen. They weren't the first in there, but they were in there, pretty early. And I think somebody had said to me, oh yeah, well, everyone's the first into Bergen-Belsen. I was like, oh, crap, better go and check, this guy told me. I did do quite a lot of fact checking. I did go, is this possible? Is this feasible? Anyway, fortunately, they were. So he may well have been in the ones. He may well have been in a unit that wasn't, but he heard about it from other people. You never know. So yeah, there is a risk that you are being told a story, but I think you know that, I know that, the reader knows that.
Yeah.
It doesn't invalidate the experience that I think is a collective experience, and it is very much a collective experience. Somebody felt that.
I'm glad you said it, because I was struck by the theme, not the theme, well, sort of the thematic way you did the book. You didn't do it, here's Fred's story, chapter 1, here's Jim's story. I mean, there's a certain amount of, each chapter has a 2 or 3 key people, but you sort of spread their things throughout the book, and you're looking at the themes, which I think is very interesting, because I say the collective experience is coming through more than the individual experience, although it's framed from the point of view of an individual experience, but it creates and tells a wider story. So I found that really interesting. Let's do a couple of these personal stories and the photos, and then we'll do perhaps some more questions about the process later on. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, by the way.
Well, this is Nina. Nina was amazing. She was the Moscow State University liaison point of contact for World War II veterans in Moscow State University. And so, she's wearing all her medals. She was a partisan. So she was 12 when the war broke out, 12, 13. She was in Western Belarus. So they got bombed pretty early on. They were the ones that sort of went, oh, here they come. And she one day heard her brother going up into the loft and doing something. So she hid, basically, to work out what it was that he was doing. And she found out that he was cleaning a gun, and discovered that her parents and her brother were working for the partisans. And so she said, we want in too. So this is her with her 2 sisters. That's Nina there. She's the middle one. On the right hand side. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but anyway, she's on the right hand side. She's on the right hand side as you're looking at it. Her older sister in the middle and her younger sister on the left there. And so, because they were school age, she said, we were like gold dust because we could pass through checkpoints. They didn't ask us much. So they were asked to do some pretty dangerous stuff. She had to go in and check out, they had a railway observation point not far from the house, and the guys used to come in and chat to them, because her mother spoke a bit of German, because her mother had been I think she had to work for the Germans in the First World War, so she had ended up speaking a little bit. She had been 13, 14 herself at the time, had no love for the Germans particularly, but they kept their noses clean, and they sort of got information by having Germans come out to their house and chat. So they found out that they were either building a new railway or some particular convoy was coming through. So she had to go in and check what the windows were, how many men inside the observation post, how many guns, etc. And so she took a basket of eggs and said, I've got eggs for you. And they went, put the basket down and go away. She said, no, I have to take the basket back. So I have to take the eggs out in your kitchen. And then so she went in, did what she needed to do, went home and told her parents what she needed to tell them. And there was another occasion when they had to take a gun to a neighbouring village, and they wrapped it up in a ball of wool in a basket. And the three of them carried it together until they got to the checkpoints, and then one of them had to carry it because obviously it's really light. It's only a basket of wool. And so they managed to get through. But her, they witnessed quite a lot of horror. Obviously, they had some massacres of Jews in their area, and some pretty horrendous experiences that they had with sort of casual killing around them. And her little sister on the left there, Larissa, was found in the woods, murdered at the age of 12. She was at the time. And she had been tortured, but she hadn't given anyone up. And I mean, Nina had to tell the story a couple of times, actually, because I ended up following a documentary crew around, and because our interpreter was a bit stretched, he sort of doubled us up occasionally. So I heard her story a couple of times. But even though it seemed rehearsed, the emotion was still very much there. She's not switching on waterworks when she talks about her baby sister being found dead in the woods. She's reliving that. But the other thing that you could really see was how totally proud she was, totally proud of her own input as a partisan, and also unbelievably proud that her sister hadn't given anybody up.
I want to expand on the fact you spoke to people from Belarus and China, and not just, I mean, you did have a few smattering of Normandy veterans and things like that, but you spoke to people from parts of the world where casual violence was just a day-to-day occurrence. In Normandy, where I live, there were some massacres by the SS of Allied troops and the odd nasty incident, but they are rarities. You go, the further east you go, the more daily they become, the more hourly, the more. And the same with the Sino-Japanese war. Just the casual violence on a biblical kind of scale. When you were speaking to survivors who'd seen that, do you think that the amount of things these happened hardened them so that they sort of downplayed the violence, or do you think they were able to convey the violence sort of accurately? And again, what I was saying to John is some of the books of compilation of British memoirs, there's a sort of a nicety about it, because British, even Arnhem, for example, the British prisoners of war taken there were treated quite well. They weren't rounded up and shot like you would get in the Warsaw Uprising. So was there a difference when you speak to people from these areas where the violence was just, by our standards, off the charts?
I would say yes, to an extent. I mean, I'm now so familiar with what's in my book that I almost feel, I read John's and I was like, oh my God, they told him that? Wow. And I thought, nobody really told me anything particularly awful, because I'm so familiar with it now myself. I'm sort of also slightly inured to it. Did they, there's all sorts of different emotions. I think they're less focused on the violence than they are on the sort of, it almost takes them back to that feeling of resentment
right.
and revenge, and so they can put themselves back there. But now in their modern mind they go, yes, but we know that all people are the same, and so on and so forth. So again, to go back to the earlier point about self-selecting, there is a sort of, there's now a sort of, if you like, it's a bit cynical, but a civilized veneer over what they're telling you. Are they inured to it? To an extent, but they can still very much take themselves back, feel resentful, feel that vengeful instinct, feel pride of what they did, in their own retaliatory sort of efforts. And I think they still do feel the brutality of it. I mean, I did ask them, does it seem like completely unthinkable now when we sit in this living room, when we sit here and the world as it is today, and we've all got digital things, and I mean, it's so immeasurably different. And you know, some of them sort of said, well, that was then, this is now, sort of thing. But for my mind, I can't quite get my head around that whole, you know, here we are sitting here talking about what happened to you when you were 12 and 13, and look at what your kids are going through. So for some of them, it was the response to that was, I could not see my grandchildren go through that. I would not want my grandchildren to be, who are 11 and 12 or 13 or whatever they happen to be sent off to war because some muppet in power thinks it's a good idea to, you know, to go and, you know, she's got to go and be a nurse and tend all these wounded people. So that was, I suppose, how they kind of fold that time and how they could sort of make it relevant and identifiable for us now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is getting increasingly difficult for younger people to relate to just how those events were so violent because it seems so abstract. And, you know, and people have made I've made comparisons myself to the, you know, the COVID-19 era in a sense brought together the sort of a similar or an echo of like the Blitz spirit or some togetherness. But then at the same time, you go, no, it's a very different tragedy on a different type of scale, but it's all we've got. It's all we've got is to use our experiences and somehow transpose them to the events of World War II. I mean, I literally spend my life talking about the war, and yet it does still feel very abstract because of the violence, because of the numbers of people who were killed and traumatized by it. It does seem like sometimes it is it's like a separate universe. It's like the Star Wars universe. It's so horrific. It was happening elsewhere in a different place, and it wasn't. It was just a few years ago. But there's still a few more stories.
Well, they call it compassion fatigue when you've got that many numbers. And you know, and they did, and I did ask them, do you think people now can understand it? And they said not really. You know, unless you've been through it, you can't. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We can maybe come back to some of the others, but I'm going to skip to if I can find him. Hold on, where is he? I'm going to skip to Nikolai, who is this rather wonderful man, who, and I'll show you the next one as well. We'll come back to that because that's his jacket, right?
That's a medal rack and a half, isn't it? God damn, how much brasso does he need?
Yeah, he wore that for 8 hours because this was one of those occasions when I was shadowing the documentary maker. And that there on the right is the map of his war experience. So
good grief.
Yeah. So Nikolai was a farm boy out in the middle of, I don't know, deepest, darkest eastern Russia. And he signed up to be a pilot. So he got trained as a pilot in 1940. And he was in training when war broke out. And their trainers were people who had experienced the war against the Finns. And so they all knew what was coming, even though, you know, they had a pact obviously with Germany. They sort of had a suspicion that it wasn't gonna stick. So he was out doing a cross country run or something when you know they had to run cross country back to the school when war broke out. So they were all pretty stoked because they kind of were trained for this, but they didn't really have many planes. So he eventually got picked to be a navigator with one of their better pilots, and he was out taking on aerial reconnaissance, taking photos of Stalingrad, and they came back and the pictures were blurry, so they got sent back out again. And you know, when they were taking the pictures was when they were most vulnerable because they had to fly at a consistent speed and so on and so forth. And, you know, it had to be steady and all that sort of stuff, and they got shot down. So they got shot down outside Stalingrad, and they were lucky because they got shot down somewhere where they could be picked up. Their radio guy died, you know, and that was one of the people that you remember. But in a way, because I wasn't leading this interview, you know, there were many more rabbit holes that I would have gone down, you know, because for me to speak with him was, you know, he had a lot to say. But the one rabbit hole that I did go down, so when he got shot down, they didn't have enough planes to send him back out again. So they said, right, you can sit around here doing nothing, not contributing to the war, or you can go and be retrained. And so they kind of, you know, will be retrained. And he got retrained as a cavalry mounted artilleryman horses, because the horses could cover more distance. They would cover sort of 40, 50 miles in a day. and they were covering, you may remember, obviously, because the war was a bit delayed and Hitler kind of got a bit more bogged down than he expected. Literally, the horses could actually make it through the sorts of terrain that the mechanized stuff couldn't. So they could cover a bit more distance. So he had, you know, a lot of different adventures, which sounded like adventures, but you know, were clearly not. But the one moment that I managed, so he talked, so the guy who was leading the interview sort of said, oh, you know, can you explain again how the horses would bring the cannons round, and, you know, and there would be the noise, and so can you just describe that one more time for the tape? He said, yeah. And I said, sorry, can I interrupt with a question? I said, did you ever lose a horse? And the whole room just went, and he said, yeah, I had to shoot my horse on the battlefield because I was in this place. I moved away to do something. My orderly was there with the two horses, and the orderly got shelled and his horse died, and my horse was looking at me and I had to shoot it. And he would have died anyway, but he would have died in pain. And so that moment, you know, was the one moment where I really felt like, wow, you know, this man with all these medals. So this is what he did. He lasted the whole war, right? He said, I was on the front almost all the time and I made it. His son at 10 o'clock in the morning was trying to give us vodka. So I'm going to read a little bit about what Nikolai said. So this is Nikolai on Victory Day, right? Victory Day. So he's not far from Berlin, but they're not nicely dressed enough to go and meet the Americans, I think it was. So they said somebody else. But so they have a big party and they go back to where he's staying. He's billeted with some German family, and he says, big party. At some point, everyone left. 2 German soldiers were passing by. Just back home, they were infiltrating through the battle formations. The door was plywood. They knocked it down. They were told that officers there were celebrating Victory Day, which both the old man, the father-in-law, that's the guy he was staying with, and the doorman could hear. So they broke the window, poured fuel from the tank on the motorcycle, on the staircase, and set it on fire. The staircase was on fire. The old man and the doorman jumped out of the windows and started yelling. Mariana was screaming. I ended up at hers for some reason. Mariana's the woman who owns the house. You know, he's obviously, anyway, he's ended up at hers for some reason. She woke me up. So they jumped out, started calling for help. Germans are disciplined. They all came to the house. Meanwhile, I was still drunk in bed. Germans came, put down the fire. At some point, I got up, opened the door, and realised there was no staircase. The staircase was burned. The motorcycle was burned. Meanwhile, the orderly was waiting at the entrance. He said a ladder would be brought. Why am I telling you this? For the first time ever, I got drunk and Germans almost burned me alive. That's why vodka never does any good to anyone. That's like, and I'm going, and his son was trying to give us vodka at 10 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, he was clearly teetotal. I think his son was probably carrying the PTSD for him. But he got around, old Nikolai.
I mean, that's that kind of insightful story. That him just recounting the dates of when he went into action, all these different campaigns, would have been interesting, but not particularly revealing. I mean, it would have been. But the fact that he had this incident that affected his not interpretation, but his vision of alcohol, and that was a memory that carried on. That's it's trivial, but it's really interesting in a paradoxical way.
Well, he has quite a few photos of girls on his map as well, so I think there was a bit of a history there. But and Mariana was quite possibly one of them. Who knows? But I think he also had some fun along the way. But we didn't get into that, unfortunately, because that could have been quite an interesting story.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, these are I'm hanging off every word again, so keep on going, and then we've got a few more questions for you later on that building up.
So let me take us over to Japan. Okinawa, actually. So this is on the left is the USS Bofin. If anybody's been to Pearl Harbor, you might have seen it. It's tiny, pokey, really, really cramped under there. I mean, I'm sure no submarine is particularly comfortable, but this one is especially mini. And it's there as a memorial to the war, and you know, it has a bit of its history and so on and so forth. And I went and I saw this in January 2018, I think it was. And in September 2018, I went to a museum set up in memory to the Tsushima Maru, which was a passenger evacuation ship that was leaving Okinawa for the mainland to take mostly children. It had 800 something passengers on it, mostly children and some of their teachers. And they were all packed up onto this little ship with their bento boxes. And, you know, I the next day I met someone actually whose colleague had put his sister on the boat with a bento box, you know, the little rice balls, and remembered seeing her off. And on the right-hand side there is the display in the Tsushima Maru Museum. Now, there's nothing in that museum in English, nothing, except for this one little bit. And I know you can't read the words, but it's effectively that little dim thing in the left-hand bottom corner there. If you can see it, it looks like a submarine underwater. That's the bowfin. And next to it is the bowfin and its specs, because it was the bowfin that torpedoed and sank the Tsushima Maru with its 800 kids on it. And I'm thinking to myself, hang on a sec, wait, hang on, didn't I just see that in Pearl Harbor? And is that like there to sort of show how amazing everything? The guys on that bowfin weren't told for, you might know this, it was years, I can't remember how many years, but they weren't told that they had sunk a ship full of children for obvious reasons, right? There was an awful lot of stuff that people weren't told in the war because it would have absolutely shot their morale. But I was really stunned at, you know, this is almost the opposite of, you see the Death Railway engine in Tokyo and it's sort of, whoa, look at our magnificent engineering feat, and you see the bowfin in Pearl Harbor and it goes, whoa, look at this, you know, it helped us win the war. And then on the other side of the world you've got prisoners of war who built it, and many of whom starved to death, and you've got, you know, kids being torpedoed. And so this chap, if I can get to the next slide, this chap was supposed to be on that boat. Well, actually, he was no longer on a boat because that boat was sunk. So they didn't do any more evacuation convoys. So he was about 14. And he lived around Shuri Castle in Okinawa, which was a beautiful castle, has been restored. And he was a refugee with his mum. I think his parents had been divorced. So, you know, they were relatively badly off for not having a dad, and so they traipsed around Okinawa trying to avoid being robbed or killed by Japanese soldiers who had told them, you've got to get out of here, or shelled by artillery from the naval guns out at sea, the Americans. And this is, you know, this is one of the most brutal battles, understandably in some ways, because this is the end of the sort of Pacific chain, and the American soldiers who got here, if they had come from the beginning of that chain, were so brutalized by the experience by the time they got here, I think they couldn't have even imagined. So they're flame throwing civilians, like using flamethrowers to get civilians out of caves. This is the sort of cave that civilians were hiding in, to keep, you know, to keep away from the Japanese army as much. And the Japanese army were saying, you've got to get out of our cave because this is our cave, to their own. And the other, you know, the Okinawan experience is complicated because it had only become part of Japan in around the Meiji period, right? 1868, I think it was. And prior to that, it was the Ryukyu kingdom, which was independent. It had trade with China. And there's another gent here whose family were, if I can find him, whose family were, they'd been in Okinawa for sort of 13 generations, and the original members had been dignitaries, right, in figures of authority who dealt with trade. So they've been trade officials, ministers, and so Japan was trying to quell Okinawan, you know, and bring Okinawan identity in line with mainland Japan for not very long before Okinawa becomes the center of this battlefield. So there's an element of the Japanese, mainland Japanese, feeling quite superior to the Okinawans already, and the Okinawans just basically being caught in the crossfire between two powers that, frankly, unfortunately, didn't really give a monkeys about the noble collateral damage. So all these kids are age sort of 13, 14, either having to dig caves. You know, there were schoolgirls who were sent to be nurses. And I have a story of one of those as well. She set up a museum in later life, you know, in sort of in homage to the classmates that she lost. 200 of them went off into the battlefield, and I think 20 survived or something. And she's got this amazing museum, which is one of the best museums I've ever been to. If you ever get the chance, go to Okinawa, go to the Himiyori Museum, because this is all schoolgirls sent into the battleground to deal with unbelievably traumatized but also brutal Japanese soldiers who were mean as anything to them, and they were sent off kind of, run through that field carrying a leg to put it out in the trench over there, and brave the artillery while you go. So Okinawa was brutal for all sorts of reasons, and I know it's infamous for that, but one of the reasons to my mind is that the Americans were so traumatized by the time they got there, they really weren't worrying too much about the difference between civilians and soldiers, and the soldiers were awful too. So they witnessed some real horrors, and to that point, this gentleman was an islander from an island off Okinawa, and he was 14, 15 when the Imperial soldiers came just before the Battle of Okinawa started, and they all the Okinawans talked about brainwashing, and maybe that's something that subsequently, that's again slightly revisionism, because it probably wasn't a term that they knew at the time, but it's very much what they experienced. And these families had been told, and all of the Okinawans, and in fact the Japanese generally, had been told kichikube-e, so demons. The Americans and British are demons, and they've been shown the pictures. They've been told, if these people come and get you, you're better off like dying, basically, which is why you have the reports of the naval guys out at sea watching civilians jumping off the cliffs in Okinawa, because God forbid they should get captured by the Americans. This gentleman was instructed by his village head. They were told that if you are coming close to being captured, you all have to kill yourselves. So you have to commit suicide. And his younger siblings were too young. So he and his older brother killed them and killed their mother, and didn't quite, I guess, have the energy, the resources, the tools, the ability, the desire to kill themselves, and were captured by the Americans. And he was quite, I think his mind couldn't quite cope with what he'd experienced by the time I talked to him. So he became a pastor. But when he was captured by the Americans, I think what he probably couldn't quite believe was that they were nothing like what he'd been told. And I couldn't probe too much, because I think, for obvious reasons, he had told his story before, but it was not an easy story for him to tell. And I did ask, but I couldn't push. I mean, what was it for? When you were picked up by those Americans and you realized that they were not demons, I mean, how awful must he have felt to realize that he'd killed his whole family for nothing? So anyway, he became a pastor, and I didn't, in an instant like that, I just felt you can't talk to this man by making him go back there.
I mean, and this is, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I sort of tried to ask the question, but then I thought, God, it's way too cruel.
This is why I was the minute you emailed me a few weeks ago, and I looked at your website, I looked about the book, and then you sent me the book. I realized this is not your bog standard. Here's what some nice cuddly old veterans said in a pub book. Not that there's anything wrong with those books. I have a whole shelf full of those kind of books. And it's not also that you're trying to, be edgy and try and, have a big T-shirt of war is hell. We all know war is hell. I think it was whichever French film director it was. It might have been Francois Truffaut said that by definition all war films are anti-war films. All books about the war are anti-war, because if you're highlighting the truth of the brutality of war, you don't need to label it. This is an anti-war book. This is a book that's trying to make people realize wars are shit. If you just tell the stories, that should be self-evident that wars are shit. We had a question earlier on about that while you're talking about that story there, that I think is fairly pertinent. William said, were veterans of particular theatres you've interviewed more likely to share their stories than others? Any correlation there? I mean, obviously, you've just told us that harrowing story of Okinawa, and then you had the Nina from Belarus, and where they did tell you their stories, but there were some bits they didn't. Well, in this case, they didn't quite go into detail, and you didn't push them either. But were there particular trends to particular nations or of people you spoke to where they were more or less likely to open up?
Well, I think anyone who's been through this, it's fairly well documented that it's much easier to tell your story if you won, right? Because you've got something to be proud of. It's much easier to tell your story if you were on the right side. So either the right side is winning, and it's not that history is told by the victors, because I don't believe that at all. History is told by the people on whose land you are standing, as I've tried to demonstrate with that Yushka, stuff. But it's that you can be proud if you feel like you're on the right side, and I don't think that the Germans feel like they were on the right side. I don't, even though the bullies were the ones in charge, and no German soldier was ever a Nazi if you speak to them afterwards, the Japanese also, for the Japanese, it was even more institutionalized, right? The shame of losing.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you this guy here. Wait, let me just make sure I find. So Yamada-san, he was in the Burmese jungle, and to survive was a disgrace. So they went home and everybody was like, well, what are you doing here? You should have killed yourself. We think that the Japanese were incredibly brutal to the enemy, which they were, but they were so unbelievably brutal to themselves, to each other. I mean, they were brutalized. So, and I think it was a Holocaust survivor said, no country has the moral high ground on these things. We did awful things too. It's just that we can brag about the fact that we won. We're not going to. I've read accounts of British soldiers going in and doing unspeakable things to Holocaust inmates, survivors. It wasn't just them that did it. It was more of them. It was more of them because it was culturally acceptable and because it was, they were absolutely programmed to be like this. I mean, I'll read you a little bit about what Yamada-san said. He said, so he says, first, there was a military soldier exam. You line up and you take off all of your clothes except your underwear. Because I passed with a top score, I entered the military troop. It was hell. I wanted to run away. They slapped me every day with a slipper, and it affected my jaw. I cried in the bathroom. Because it was so painful, I wanted to go to the battlefield as early as possible. It was so painful. So then he spends 20 days on a ship with 1,500 other people. The height of our room in the bottom of the ship was low. Very low. It was dark and it was like hell. So I asked him, could you sleep? No. You were sitting genuflect? Yes. It was so miserable that some people just killed themselves. When we got off at Singapore, we couldn't walk. Our muscles became so weak. So they had to leave guys in Singapore to sort of try and rehabilitate them so that they were actually well enough to be sent off to the front lines in Burma. And they were put on open coal trucks. And then he describes it, he says, the sparks were flying back. It was like shooting stars. And you think, oh my God, there's like in all this horror. And he's sort of talking about shooting stars. Oh, I guess you've got to find beauty in something. So he ended up in the Burmese jungle. He was in logistics and he was sent up right towards the end. And he said, and as we were getting there, all our troops were starting to retreat towards us. We thought, what the hell's going on? Clearly we were losing. And he then spent weeks in the jungle watching injured retreating soldiers blowing themselves up with grenades. And, because to die is better than to be taken captive, because they were told that the American soldiers would cut off their penises, which, as you will have read, sort of what happened in Iwo Jima, that's what the Japanese did to the Americans. But they thought that was what was going to happen to them. And again, I'm not justifying any of this, but if you look at their own history, they would take the people from the neighboring village, kill all the men, take all the women as sex slaves. So if they're going to do that to the people in the neighboring village, they're sure as hell going to do it to somebody from a different country.
You're making the distinction, I think, between the ideology of the Nazis and the Japanese that contains horror and violence and rape and murder and atrocities, but then at the bottom, that's from the top down. But then there's the bottom up of just what happens to human beings who experience profound levels of violence, and you see that with the people, not the ISATs group and themselves, but the people alongside those kind of people, or the people alongside the people performing the really cruel acts, is that they get institutionalized themselves. It becomes normal. We've talked about that, the use of alcohol in the Third Reich, so to sort of dull the senses after the horrible things they did, and that brutalization of people happens to the victors and the defeated. I think that's why people struggled with the Pacific series when it first came out. They didn't fall in love with it like they did Band of Brothers, because Band of Brothers had liberation and some sort of flag waving at the end and a sense of bringing back freedom, where the scenes with Snafu and people like that, played by Rami Malek in the Pacific, of him, the casual disregard for dead Japanese. We all felt, we all squirmed in our seats a little bit at that, because we don't like to think of that aspect of what happens to people, Marines and infantrymen who are sent into these hellish places. So, it's the experiences you had doing this were obviously profound. So let's do a couple more stories, if you don't mind. Then we'll do a couple of questions.
Just to finish with him, he actually got captured in the jungle by the Scots in the end, and so he spent a year and a bit with the Scots. Loved them. Said we played rugby, and then he cried when he got home and he saw Mount Fuji. But the Scottish captain that had them used to sing to them. So he said at the very end of the interview, he said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" So I thought, here we go. Ask me a bit about my work, and so he said, "Will you sing me a song?" So I sang him Auld Lang Syne, and we all, it was a bit of a moment. So who else can I tell you about? So let me tell you about Keiko. So she was 8 when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Her dad had an inkling, based on the fact that Hiroshima was one of the few cities that had not actually been bombed, that it might have been being saved for something special, or its time was going to come. So he moved them outside of the city a bit. So they were over a hill when the bomb dropped. But her dad was involved in the cleanup, and he always used to carry the torsos because he was youngish and strong. So he was sort of looking into the faces of the dead people. And she became a peace activist afterwards. She's actually she's on the Nobel Peace Prize site because she was one of the activists involved with there've been a couple of prizes lately. Last year, Nihon Hidankyo, which is the Hibakusha nuclear bomb survivors organization, they won for spreading the word about, against nuclear proliferation. And I had interviewed a few of them as well. But she set up Hiroshima Interpreters for Peace. So they send interpreters around the peace gardens to talk about the stories. And she has done a lot of speaking overseas. So I'll read a little bit about what she said as well, because she was in America giving a lecture, and she was at university talking to aspiring military entrants. And then they were sent off to an old folks home. And she said there were around 200 veterans. And I met one who was 95 years old. He knew Enola Gay, the bomber, B-29. And he was talking to me about that. And I said, yes, I know that. And he was so happy. There's someone that knows. He's so proud of the B-29. So when I said goodbye to everyone, his wife came and she thanked me a lot. I haven't seen my husband so happy, laughing and smiling and speaking more than 1 minute, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. She was so excited. She was almost going to cry because she was so happy to hear her husband smiling and talking, because there was someone who knows that B-29. And he said that airplane can load the biggest bomb in those days. And he was proud of it. Yes, I know, I said. Ah, you know that? How wonderful. So I couldn't tell him.
Wow.
And she said she'd been in to give talks at she said, we're selective about how we tell things, right? She was under that bomb. The people that I talked to, there was another guy in the same room with her who subsequently became a nuclear scientist. He was 14. He was outside Hiroshima. They had the first trucks of people coming through, and they're all talking about the skin is just hanging off them. It's peeling off them like gloves. And they were told you can't give them water because it will kill them, and so someone did give them water. They were going to die anyway, but then they die, and then they feel like traumatized for the rest of their lives because they gave water to someone who had been under the bomb, and so they obviously killed them. So there's there's just, and then if you are actually under the bomb, this is not just a one-time thing, by the way. You are scarred mentally, physically,
Yeah.
and societally for life, because even the children of the Hibakusha were considered semi-untouchable. So if you had been anywhere near that bomb, nobody knew quite how it was going to affect you, and so you were unmarriageable. You were, I mean,
Wow, never thought about that. Yeah.
Yep. So
Wow.
it goes on. It goes on. It is still a thing, even for the younger generations, the younger people, the children of the Hibakusha. It is still a thing.
And the irony of that is, they're both right in their perceptions. The B-29 was an amazing piece of technology. It was the most expensive thing the US built in World War II, more expensive than Manhattan Project. It's hard to argue that the firebombing of the cities and the bombs did help bring the end to the war. And yet they are also these emblems of destruction and horror, and it can be both. I mean, I always use this parallel myself, is when I see the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster, the 10-year-old boy in me just goes, oh my God, wow, there goes the Lancaster. Listen to the sound of those 4 Merlin engines. And I'm more excited than walking out an FA Cup final, But the other part of me goes, yes, Paul, but that also destroyed cities and killed civilians. But it's okay to have those two feelings in my head at the same. I've rationalized the fact it's okay. It's okay to have, as long as I have the one to balance the other one, I'm okay with it myself, I think.
Okay, well, tell me how you did that. You can tell me afterwards how you did that. I mean, to be fair though, we get Hercules flying over us quite regularly, and I'm always running out to the window going, "Oh, look, it's 2 Hercules! Wow, it's so amazing!" We get fighter jets as well, and I get excited too. I slightly question whether 2 bombs was necessary. 2 atomic bombs. But...
Yes, I mean, yes, we could have that discussion. I kind of feel yes, the second one. Anyway, that's another subject
3 days.
For another day.
It's a war of 5 years. You've had 3 days to surrender, and you haven't done it yet. So get on.
I see your point. Let's do another story, and then we'll do a couple of questions.
This is Teruko Sasaki. She was a nurse, teenager, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and she went in. A bunch of them got together, got in a truck, went in and started teaching the injured. They didn't have much. I can't remember what she said. They had some kind of powder, and they took what they had, which was almost nothing, and the place was devastated. Obviously, there's one atomic bomb dome left standing now as a memorial, which was gutted, and bodies everywhere. And she remembers the flies. She remembered the maggots, right? 2, 3, 4 days after the bombing, all these live people with no skin going, it's itching, right? Because they just got maggots breeding on them. And a photo that I appear to have not put in, much to my chagrin, but is another gentleman who was actually on the outskirts. Sorry, I'm bouncing around a bit, but he was on the outskirts of Hiroshima. So he was conscripted, I think age 17 or 18. They had no kit, but they were given a grenade because they were supposed to be throwing themselves underneath the American tanks when they finally landed. And then the bomb dropped, and they saw the flash, and they were sent into Hiroshima to do corpse clear up. And he qualified as a Hibakusha himself. So as I mentioned, it comes with all the stigma attached. And he didn't tell his wife for 40 years, I think, that he was a Hibakusha. But every year on the anniversary, he used to sit in front of the TV and listen to the radio and the broadcasts and, genuflect and so on. And she kind of obviously had a bit of an inkling. And then when he eventually told her, she said, let's go, right? Let's go and pay our respects and at the memorial. And then he said he never shut up. He became a member of Nihon Hidankyo. I think he was the secretary of his chapter where he was from. And he had been a teacher. So he was incredibly keen on sort of spreading the word. He sort of said, I can't talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. It's so traumatic. And yet he talked about it. And he talked about picking up bodies of mothers with their babies entwined, charred, and how even though they were completely desensitized to the whole experience, they're picking up bodies and having to throw them on the back of trucks, and bodies and bodies and bodies. Every time they came to one of these mothers and children, they tried to pick it up so carefully so that they wouldn't separate them and put them on a door together so that the mother and the baby would still be together. And he said, and that was the moment, that was the only moment that we felt our humanity.
Wow. A pertinent time to then ask you a question that came in earlier from Rob again. How do you think you've been affected yourself by these stories? I mean, I said to John, he got to know people he never met. Well, in most cases, you actually met and looked these people in the eye. You spent time with them. You saw their houses and what have you. Again, it's a sort of trite interviewer's question, but how did you? What was your personal journey, Lucy? But clearly, it has had a profound effect on
you. I suppose there's a lot of different strands to that. I did feel, as I mentioned in my comment when John was speaking earlier, it was very hard to leave them. I think in the immediate moment, that was the hardest thing, was just you've shared something profound, and these people, and particularly the Japanese, I think, who some of Yamada-san and his Burmese jungle experience, he'd never shared that before. These are incredibly traumatic memories, and so I it feels a bit mercenary. It's a little bit like, as I said at the beginning, I couldn't really say, no, I don't want to hear a story because it doesn't fit my narrative. It feels like I spent time with you. I never felt like I could walk away and that they didn't go with me. So the Brits and Americans, a lot of them I've stayed in touch with. When my book came out, I have made every effort to make sure that everyone gets a copy. I'm actually going to Japan next month, so I'm going to take copies to the people who are still around in Hiroshima, all their families, if they're not still around, which many of them obviously aren't. So that it gave me a sense, which I suppose I had anyway, which is why I did this. But it really helped me to understand that we are all underneath it all, for all the machinations that are going on top with the politics and with these people who are trying to manipulate us. Underneath it all, we all just want the same things. We all just want the same things, and we can be easily manipulated. Yeah. But they were easily manipulated. We can be easily manipulated. We're just fortunate that we were on the right side of this in a way. It could have been us. I mean, look at what America's done with its history of we are the heroes who saved the world, right? And we've gone in with them. We've gone in with them because we don't do anything that's not a just war, because that's our history, right? We're always the good guys who are saving the world. And are we?
Yeah. I mean, living in France as I do, I'm always grateful that the Brits, as an example, don't have to deal with the dilemma of being occupied. Would I have accommodated the arrival of these enemy people? Would I have bowed to? Would I have resisted immediately? Would I have endangered my family? This is what the French have to go through, and the Norwegians and the Danes and all these other countries. But the Brits, bombs fell, absolutely. People were killed by it, and people had profound experiences. And of course, there are Brits around the world, as you and John have talked about, people interned and stuff. But your average Brit in London or Manchester or Liverpool didn't have to confront that. What would I do in that situation of an enemy marching down my street? And so, we all have from whatever country we're from, we have certain bits of the war we don't have to delve into.
And the Americans are even further away. Let's face it. I mean, Pearl Harbor was bombed, but a lot of them didn't know where that was when it was bombed.
Yeah, we have another question. I think a great question from Fraser here, who's a relatively new member of the sidebar there. What did these interviewees feel about their narratives being lost as time passes by? We've talked about what you were getting out of the interviews themselves, and whether we, as the reader of the interviews, are getting information and what it's teaching us. But was some of these people you interviewed who had never given their stories before? Were they surprised you were asking them the questions in the first place? Were they worried that their stories wouldn't be heard? Did they even care that
they cared? They really cared. So particularly the gentleman I was talking about with the corpses, in the aftermath of Hiroshima. One thing I noticed in Japan, again, I think this is partly the shame, partly the fact that they all marched into it somewhat blindly, and there's much more soul searching in Japan about what the F, right? How did we get into this? Why did it happen? How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? So there's a really, even though the government takes a lot of stick, and rightly so, for maybe not having apologized quite as many times as it should, not having institutionalized the apology in quite the same way that Germany has, but they have apologized. But, it's very tricky, right? The politics of that, but the people are like desperately trying to keep the story alive, desperately trying to get some kind of admission from their government, So this guy, let me see, hold on, where is he? Matsumoto-san. Matsumoto-san, he was sent in at the very last minute. His commanding officer, I think, killed a Chinese family that had been helping them. And he was taken prisoner. He thought he was going home. He was put into prison in Siberia. He did such a good job, he said, Toyota method of building houses, that he got sent home after 3 years. And there's an organization called Chukiren in Japan, which is returnee soldiers from China who are trying to say, this is what we did, right? We did these things. And they are pilloried because it's like a Holocaust scenario almost in Japan. It's like, you did what? No, get over it, right? You didn't do that. Don't be ridiculous. We were never that bad. Right, even the comfort woman thing is contentious, even though everybody knows it happened. One of the women said, these people were fathers, and when they came home, they didn't want to admit what they'd done when they were overseas. So, I think I might have gone slightly off topic with the question there, but I think these Japanese particularly are desperate for this not to get lost. Desperate, and the bomb survivors are saying, we know what it's like to be under a bomb fired in anger. This is insane.
Yeah. Terry down to see amazing and noble that some Japanese are now confronting these issues. And we had a question about whether you talk to some of the victims of, for example, the Axis, China, you mentioned comfort women, the Chinese, Korean laborers, things like that. And I had to judge some entries for a World War II documentary film competition, festival a few years ago. And 3 or 4 of the documentaries, your very typical slick, flags fluttering, nice soundtracks about various veterans, and it was great stuff. But there was one I watched, which was the most amateurly put together, really ropey quality VHS. And it was 4 hours of interviews with comfort women in China and Korea. And I felt I had to watch it all because I've got to fairly judge this competition. But basically, it was an endless loop, as you can imagine, of horrors after horror after horror, to the point where I was numbed to it after about 2 hours. Well, my brain just devised some means of just moving on. But to refer to what I think was Scott's question and yours in the cyber, we have heard those stories of the victims. What we haven't heard as much are of the stories of the perpetrators, and particularly the perpetrators who have admitted it was a shit thing to do and are grappling with it. I don't want to hear about the bloody, the Nazis who were unrepentant till their final days. Those fuckers can go and fuck themselves, as far as I'm concerned, But the ones that have grappled with it, the ones that have spent the rest of their lives saying, "How could I have done those things?" And I'm glad you brought that element to your book, because as uncomfortable as it makes it feel, and even putting these people on the spot, although they clearly did want to talk about it, watching someone go through a process of anguish can't have been easy for you. Well, I mean, as well as that.
So obviously, I spoke to Yamada-san, who had his own experience of watching his compatriots blowing themselves up in the jungle, which was deeply traumatic. And not really what they signed up for. It wasn't what he signed up for from the get-go. He signed up for glory and serving his country, and he got smacked around the face with a slipper. Matsumoto-san was sent off in February of 1945 and told he was going to Manchuria. This Chinese family provided them, this boy gave them water and gave them food. And, whether it was him who killed the boy or whether it was his officer who killed the boy, I think it was his officer. It could have been him, but he just didn't want to say it. But he said that boy followed him around. That boy, the ghost of that boy followed him around, and was behind every tree. And I suppose his way of dealing with it was that he felt bitter about about having been used by his government. So he positioned himself as a victim, and I think that's probably fair, given everything I've said about the way they were brutalized and put into that position. He couldn't have said no. So it's not that he positioned himself as a victim in that position of being evil to the Chinese family, because I don't think he was actually. But it was more, he felt he felt everybody deserved an apology, right? He felt that the government should
Yeah.
actually be going, not, well, you're a bit embarrassing, let's just kind of get rid of you and not sort of share your story, right? You could just shut up and get over there in the corner. We're not giving you a medal because you did something really bad, not that we told you to do it. So he just felt I think the whole thing was really complicated for him. He was like, I want everyone to know we need to apologize to the comfort women. Frankly, my government needs to apologize to us. It was more in that context, right? We're not fessing up about the comfort women. This thing's not going to go away. We've got to do the right thing. We've got to say how brutal we were. We've got to admit all the awful things that we did. And by the way, you know what? My government was shit to me too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've got a couple more questions to you. People are going to want me to invite you back for a second part of this, which I'm more than happy to do. But Pete G asked very early on, Lucy, did you ever expect your research to go on for 4 years? And if so, would you have never started it? And I think there's a lot of people in the sidebar who have begun history projects who halfway through thinking, why the hell did I start this?
I would have gone on for longer had it not been for COVID. To your point about comfort women, I actually had lined up to go visit some comfort women in the Philippines. And it's not because I'm like, oh, gosh, I'm going to get a comfort woman. But I really felt like I could do something for them. I felt that, you know, my husband kept saying to me, if somebody wants to tell you their story, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And then COVID hit. And in a way, you know, thanks to COVID, there is a book, because otherwise I'd still be out there. So, yeah. I mean, I think it was going to go on for 4 years. Svetlana Alexievich took 7 years to get, and I should be so worthy, right? She took 7 years to get her book to print, and if you haven't read that, oh my God, it's like the absolute, it's the pinnacle of oral history telling and punch in the gut stuff. So,
wow. Well, send me the link to that. I'll add it to the description.
Yeah. It's amazing.
In good show business, well, I'm going to leave people wanting more because that's the best way to do it. But I'm going to leave it with Dennis's words, the eloquent journalist from the West Coast there. I hope one of Lucy's chief emotions is pride in her work, in bringing these stories to light, illustrating the true cost of war. Well said, Dennis. Yeah, I mean, we thank the people for sharing their accounts with the historians, but we need to thank the historians for going out there and getting these interviews and putting yourself in that position. And clearly, this hasn't just been let's get a collection of stories about what people thought on VE Day and how they had bunting and they had cake. And again, there's nothing wrong with those books. Is that you've tried to go to the project took you to a level of depth that has ended up with this fantastic book. So we will end things there, folks. I'll hold up my copy again. Have you got your copy there with you? Have you got a copy with you as well, Lucy?
No, I haven't. But you know what? It just came out in hardback today for anybody who wants hardback.
Well, there's my copy anyway.
Sorry about that.
No worries. But we said we'll definitely invite you back for a part 2 because I feel we've only gone a little way into your repertoire. It's been an amazing show, and I think it is well having John on earlier to talk about people who are going out and getting these last accounts, because I say that door is closing. We won't have that ability in a few years' time, although we've got an incredible database to draw on. So there we are. Go and buy the book, folks. I think you'll all appreciate it. And folks, I'll be back again tomorrow when we're talking about the escape of the Latvians from Berlin in 1945 with Vince. So click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.